There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to very old mountains, not the silence of emptiness, something older, something you feel in your chest before you understand what you're feeling. The Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina carry this silence, the way they carry their stone, not as an absence, but as a presence. Stand in those mountains on a winter morning, and you will understand immediately why a certain kind of man would look out at those ridges and feel something shift inside him. Not peace, something more dangerous than peace. Recognition. In 1887, one of the wealthiest young men in America stood in those mountains and felt it, and what happened next would consume his fortune, his health, his years, and ultimately, his life. He would build something no one had ever attempted in America. Something that still stands today, exactly where he put it, carrying secrets that most people who visit it never learn. He built the greatest private home in American history, and it buried him. This is that story, and it begins not with the house, but with the obsession that made the house inevitable. Part 2. The Making of an Obsessive. To understand what happened in those mountains, you first have to understand the man who stood in them. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born on November 14, 1862, the youngest son of William Henry Vanderbilt, the youngest of 8 children, in a family that had already become one of the most powerful dynasties in American history. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had built an empire of steam, railroads, and steamships threading themselves through the skeleton of a growing nation until the fortune they generated had made Cornelius, at the moment of his death in 1877, the wealthiest man in America. $100 million. In an era when a working man earned less than $1 a day. George's father doubled it. $200 million by 1885, a number that had essentially no meaning in the real world. You couldn't spend that money. You couldn't properly imagine it. You could only inherit it and try to figure out what a human being was supposed to do. When that much wealth falls into their hands, before they have figured out who they are. George was 22 when his father died. He received his share of the Vanderbilt fortune, and then he did something that nobody in his family expected. He went to the library, not metaphorically, literally. He went to the library and he stayed there. While his brothers raced horses and his sisters married European titles, and the entire Vanderbilt clan performed the elaborate social theater that Gilded Age wealth demanded, George Washington Vanderbilt II sat in rooms full of books and read. He learned languages, French, Italian, German, Greek, Latin, and more. 8 languages in total, spoken fluently, not as social accomplishments, but as tools for reaching ideas in their original form. He studied philosophy, architecture, landscape design, agriculture, art history. He traveled through Europe not as a tourist admiring scenery, but as a student dissecting buildings. Moving through the great chateau of the Loire Valley, the English country houses, the Roman villas, set into Italian hillsides, with the focused intensity of a man who needed to understand how things had been made, why they lasted, what made something worth building at all. He was assembling something in his mind. He just didn't have a location for it yet. And then one day, in 1887, visiting his mother at a resort in Asheville, North Carolina, he stepped outside, looked at the mountains, and the fog in his mind cleared completely. What followed was not a decision in the conventional sense. It was something closer to a surrender. The quiet man from the noisy family looked out at the Blue Ridge Mountains and understood with a completeness that left no room for doubt that this was where he would build his life. Not Newport, not Fifth Avenue, not any of the fashionable locations where the Gilded Age competed so publicly and so relentlessly for social supremacy. Here, in these mountains, in this silence, he came back, again and again, with the specific, driven purposefulness of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for. He began to look at the land differently. Not with the eyes of a visitor, with the eyes of a possessor, he began to buy. George Vanderbilt purchased 125,000 acres, not a plot, not a farm, not an estate in the conventional sense. He bought the mountains themselves, Over several years, through agents moving quietly through the surrounding counties, he assembled a land holding nearly the size of the city of Philadelphia. 200 square miles of mountain terrain, forest, ridge, river valley, ancient farmland, acquired piece by piece with the methodical, patient relentlessness of a man who already knew, at some level, he may not yet have consciously acknowledged, that what he was building was going to demand everything. That is not ambition, that is obsession, and it had barely begun. Because what George Vanderbilt did next, before a single stone of the house was ever placed, is something that almost no account of Biltmore has ever properly explained. Part 3, The First Secret, the mountain that built itself. The year is 1889. George is 26 years old. He has assembled his team. Richard Morris Hunt, the most celebrated architect in America, the first American trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the man who designed the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. Frederick Olmsted, who gave New York City Central Park, and would give this mountain estate something equally extraordinary. Construction begins, and here is something that almost no one who visits Biltmore today knows, something that the official tours mention briefly, if at all, but that tells you more about the nature of George Vanderbilt's obsession than almost anything else. He didn't buy the stone for the house, he bought a mountain that contained stone. When George's agents were assembling that vast landholding in the mountains around Asheville, they were not simply purchasing scenery, they were purchasing resources. The land Vanderbilt acquired contained deposits of limestone, the specific, beautiful, warm-toned limestone that Richard Morris Hunt needed for the exterior of the house. And rather than quarrying stone elsewhere and transporting it across the mountains at extraordinary expense and difficulty, Vanderbilt simply opened a quarry on the estate itself. The house literally grew out of the mountain beneath it. The same earth that Vanderbilt had purchased, the same ridges and valleys he had assembled acre by acre over years of patient acquisition, was cut open and its stone extracted and shaped and set into the walls of the building rising above it. Biltmore did not arrive from somewhere else. It emerged from its own ground. But the quarry was only one secret, because getting that stone from the mountain to the construction site, across terrain that no road existed to serve in an era before the trucks and machinery that make modern construction possible, required a solution that was itself a revelation of how far the obsession was prepared to go. George Washington Vanderbilt II built a railroad, not a road. A railroad, a dedicated rail spur, constructed specifically and solely to carry materials from the quarry and from the broader supply network to the construction site. In a remote mountain location, without existing rail infrastructure, he built the infrastructure. He built the system that would allow the system to be built. Think about what that means. Before a single room of Biltmore House could be constructed, before a single stone of the exterior could be set, George Vanderbilt had already built a quarry and a railroad to serve it. He spent money, enormous quantities of money, building the machinery of construction before construction could begin. That is not how a reasonable man builds a house. That is how an obsessive builds a world. And the quarry and the railroad were still not everything, because the limestone exterior of Biltmore House is only its skin. The bones of the building, the structural core that holds 250 rooms in place against the mountain weather and the weight of time, are brick. Millions of individual bricks made on the estate. Millions of individual bricks made on the estate. A brick kiln was constructed at the Biltmore site, a dedicated manufacturing facility whose sole purpose was to produce the brick required for the building rising beside it. Over 6 years of construction, this kiln operated continuously, consuming local clay and returning it as the structural material of the house. The railroad brought what the mountain couldn't provide. The quarry gave the mountain's own stone. The kiln converted the local earth into the building's bones. Biltmore House was not imported. It was not assembled from materials shipped from distant suppliers. It grew from its own ground, was framed with its own earth, and was faced with its own stone. The obsession had found a way to make the land itself participate in its own transformation. But here is what that actually meant in human terms, what it looked like on the ground, because the quarry and the railroad and the brick kiln were not built by vision. They were built by people. And the story of those people, and what George Vanderbilt was really like when you got close enough to see him clearly, is where the obsession reveals its most unexpected face. Part 4. The machine. At the height of construction, more than 1,000 workers were employed on the Biltmore estate. Hold that number for a moment. 1,000 people working every day in the mountains of North Carolina before modern machinery, before paved roads, before any of the tools that make large-scale construction manageable today. Italian stonemasons brought from Europe because the specific skills required for the carved limestone facade existed at that level of refinement almost nowhere in America. French woodcarvers, whose work covers miles of interior surface in paneling and molding and cabinet work of extraordinary delicacy. German ironworkers, local men from Asheville and the surrounding mountain counties, grateful for steady wages in a region where work was never guaranteed. These men lived on the estate. Temporary housing was constructed for the workforce, a small city within the project, built to house the people building the building. Olmsted himself designed the permanent settlement of Biltmore Village at the estate's entrance, a planned community providing housing and services for estate workers and their families. George Vanderbilt was not indifferent to the people building his obsession. He paid fairly, housed responsibly, involved himself in the welfare of the community in ways that went beyond what a Gilded Age employer was expected to provide. He was, by every account, genuinely decent. But decent treatment did not change what the workforce was building. And at the center of all of it, directing, approving, questioning, refining, was George himself. Not a distant patron handing checks to professionals and waiting for results. A man who reviewed designs, who questioned decisions, who had opinions, specific, informed, deeply considered opinions about materials and proportions and details that most wealthy clients would never have noticed. He cared about everything, every carved stone detail, every proportional relationship between windows, every species of tree in Olmsted's landscape plan, every brick in the kiln's daily output. This was not the behavior of a man commissioning a home. This was the behavior of a man who could not stop. 6 years, 1,914 days. From the laying of the first stone to the Christmas afternoon in 1895, when George Washington Vanderbilt II opened his doors for the first time, quietly, privately, without press, without public announcement, with only family present. He had built the largest private home in America, and on the day it was finally finished, he told nobody outside his family. Maximum achievement, maximum privacy. Even at the moment of completion, the obsession refused to perform itself for an audience. But what was inside that house? What George had built into the walls themselves, into the very architecture of the rooms? That is something the official story has always moved past too quickly. Because some of what he built inside Biltmore was not just extraordinary, it was secret. Part 5. The secrets inside the walls. 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces. These are the numbers that every account of Biltmore recites, and they are extraordinary numbers, but they are not the numbers that reveal the true depth of what George Vanderbilt built inside these walls. The true depth is in the details that the numbers don't capture. The things hidden inside the grandeur that even most visitors never discover. Consider the banquet hall. It is the most dramatic room in the house. 72 feet long, a ceiling rising more than 70 feet above the floor, triple fireplaces large enough for a man to stand inside, a table that could seat 64 guests in comfort. When George entertained, which he did occasionally, selectively, in the manner of a man who genuinely enjoyed certain company rather than one performing social obligation, the banquet hall was where the most formal dinners took place, and during those dinners, music played. not from musicians visible to the guests, not from a string quartet positioned in a corner or a pianist at an instrument the guests could see. From somewhere inside the walls themselves, it seemed. Music that filled the vast space without an apparent source, that accompanied the meal like a ghost, that left guests looking around for something they could not find. The secret was a pipe organ built directly into the wall of the banquet hall, its pipes concealed within the architecture, its keyboard positioned in a hidden alcove, invisible from the dining area. And the organ required air pressure to function, bellows that had to be pumped manually during the performance. There was a hidden attendant, a person stationed behind the wall, pumping the bellows throughout the dinner, unseen by every guest in the room. George Vanderbilt built music into his walls and hired someone to hide inside them and make it work. That is the detail of a man for whom the vision was everything, for whom no element of the world he was creating was too small to perfect, for whom even the source of music at a dinner party deserved to be designed, not merely arranged. Then there is the matter of the electricity. In 1895, when Biltmore House was completed, most American cities did not have reliable electrical service. The electrical grid, as we understand it, was barely an idea. Thomas Edison had invented his practical incandescent light bulb only 16 years earlier. Most homes, even very wealthy homes, still relied on gas lighting. Most cities were still arguing about whether electrification was practical or necessary. Biltmore House was fully electrified from the first day it opened, not as a retrofit, not as a later addition. Richard Morris Hunt had incorporated electrical wiring into the building's design from the very beginning, treating electricity not as a novelty, but as an integral architectural requirement. The house had its own on-site generating system, a private power plant, built and operated solely to supply Biltmore's hundreds of electrical fixtures. George Washington Vanderbilt II built a private home with more reliable electrical infrastructure than most American cities possessed in 1895. A private home with its own power plant in the mountains of North Carolina, while the rest of America was still debating whether electricity was the future. The obsession had already decided and had built accordingly. And then there is the swimming pool, hidden in the basement levels of the house, tiled in a pattern that Vanderbilt himself had a hand in designing, fed by the estate's sophisticated plumbing system, a fully functional, heated, indoor swimming pool in 1895, in a private residence, a piece of infrastructure so far beyond the technological capacity of most American homes of the era that it would not have looked out of place in a building constructed 50 years later. George was a serious swimmer. He wanted to swim year-round, regardless of mountain weather, so he built the infrastructure to make it possible, not because it was sensible, not because it was economical, because the obsession demanded completeness, and completeness, it turns out, has a price that George Vanderbilt had convinced himself he had a plan to manage. A plan that was, at its core, one of the most intelligent delusions a brilliant man has ever constructed, to justify what he already knew he could not stop doing. Part 6. The Illusion of Self-Sufficiency. Here is something George Vanderbilt told himself. Something he believed, sincerely, genuinely, with the conviction of an intelligent man who has thought carefully about an idea and reached a conclusion he needed to be true. Biltmore would sustain itself. Not just aesthetically, not just architecturally, economically, the estate would be productive. Its farms, its forests, its dairy operations generating sufficient revenue to offset the cost of its maintenance. The scientific forestry program that Gifford Pinchot, a young forester who would go on to become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, was developing on Biltmore's vast acreage, would produce sustainable timber income. The model dairy would generate revenue. The working farms, operated according to the most advanced agricultural methods available, would be profitable. Biltmore would pay for itself. It was a beautiful idea, and George pursued it with the same consuming focus he brought to every aspect of the estate. The farms were real, producing food for the household and the workforce with genuine efficiency. The dairy was real. Biltmore's dairy operation became genuinely respected for its production methods. The forestry program was real. Pinchot developed techniques at Biltmore that would transform American conservation policy for generations. The greenhouses were real. An extensive glass complex, producing flowers and vegetables year-round, supplying the house with fresh produce, regardless of the mountain season. All of it was real, and none of it was enough, because the cost of running Biltmore was not the cost of the farms or the forests or the dairy. The cost of running Biltmore was the cost of running Biltmore. 250 rooms required a permanent staff of dozens, simply to keep them clean and functional. The grounds required groundskeepers, the stables required stable hands, the kitchen required a full brigade. The electrical system required maintenance. The plumbing required maintenance. The carved limestone exterior, miles of it, exposed to mountain weather year after year, required constant inspection and repair by craftsmen who possessed skills that were already becoming rare. The estate was a machine of extraordinary complexity, and like all machines of extraordinary complexity, it consumed resources in quantities that bore no relationship to what it produced. George knew this. He had always known this, at some level beneath the belief in self-sufficiency that he needed to sustain. The math was not complicated. The cost of maintaining Biltmore was greater than any conceivable revenue Biltmore could generate. It had always been greater. It would always be greater. Biltmore was not an investment. It was not a business. It was not a self-sustaining estate in the tradition of the great European houses it had been modeled on. It was an obsession with a budget, and the budget was running out. What happened next, in the quiet years between the house's completion and George's death, is the part of this story that nobody tells. Not because it isn't known, but because it is almost too painful to follow a man this carefully into the specific, slow way that an obsession finishes what it starts. Part 7. The Weight of the Thing. The years after 1895, after the house was finished and the great project of construction had become the lesser but perpetual project of maintenance, these are the years that the official histories of Biltmore tend to pass over quickly, because they are not dramatic years. There is no single catastrophic moment, no spectacular failure, no event that makes for a clean story of collapse. What happened to George Vanderbilt and to the Biltmore fortune in the decade and a half between the house's completion and his death was something more ordinary and more devastating than drama. It was erosion. Slow, steady, relentless erosion of the financial foundation that the obsession had been built on. The income tax, introduced in 1913, changed permanently the relationship between great private fortunes and the government. The cost of maintaining Biltmore continued undiminished. The revenue from the estate's productive operations continued to fall short of what was needed. The Vanderbilt fortune, divided among 8 children at William Henry's death, and now further consumed by 2 decades of Biltmore's appetite, was not what it had been when George first stood in these mountains as a young man of 25. He began to sell land, not the house, never the house, not the immediate estate, but the outer reaches of that vast, obsessively assembled landholding, the 125,000 acres that had been the first expression of the compulsion, sold off quietly, parcel by parcel, as the financial reality that the obsession had always refused to acknowledge, finally and patiently demanded its due. Each acre sold was an acre that George had once stood in a county office and paid for. An acre that had been part of the vision, the complete, self-contained, perfect private world set in the mountains of North Carolina. Each sale was a small retreat from the dream, and George watched it happen and could not stop it, because stopping it would have required dismantling more than land. It would have required dismantling the thing that had become his entire identity. He was not George Vanderbilt who owned Biltmore. He was Biltmore. The two had become so completely merged in the years of construction and the years of stewardship that the line between them was no longer visible. To reduce Biltmore was to reduce himself. To retreat from the vision was to retreat from the only version of himself that the obsession had left room for. So he sold the outer acres and kept the core. And the core kept consuming him. There is a particular detail in the historical record of these later years that has never received the attention it deserves. By the time George Washington Vanderbilt II died in 1914, the fortune his father had left him, his share of that staggering Vanderbilt inheritance, had been reduced to a fraction of its original size, not by bad investments, not by scandal or fraud, or any of the conventional mechanisms of financial ruin, but by Biltmore, by the steady, relentless, absolutely predictable cost of building and maintaining the most elaborate private home in American history for 25 years. A Vanderbilt, brought to the edge of financial ruin by a house, not by the excesses of the Gilded Age's social world, the parties, the mansions, the competitive display that defined his siblings' lives. George had never participated in any of that. He had been the quiet one, the one in the library, but the library had cost him everything. The obsession had been more expensive than all the ball gowns and Newport cottages and Fifth Avenue mansions combined because it had never stopped, because it could never stop, because the obsessive cannot step back and say, enough. Cannot look at what they have built and feel that it is complete, that it is sufficient, that they can now redirect their resources towards something else. The obsession always needs more, and George always gave it more until there was very little left to give. But before we reach the end, before February 1914 and the hospital table in Washington and the house waiting in the mountains, we need to understand who George Vanderbilt actually was. Because the financial collapse is not the tragedy. The tragedy is something quieter and more human than that. Part 8. The Man Behind the Monument. But here is what gets lost in the financial story. Here is what the numbers, devastating as they are, tend to obscure. George Washington Vanderbilt II was not a fool. He was not reckless in the conventional sense. He was not the caricature of the careless rich man who spends without thinking and wakes up surprised to find himself diminished. He was, by every credible account, one of the most genuinely intelligent and deeply decent men of his generation, not performing intelligence or displaying decency for social reward, actually possessing both, in the quiet, consistent way that reveals character rather than reputation. He treated his staff with fairness that went beyond what his era expected. He involved himself personally in the welfare of the workers and families who depended on the estate. He was warm with friends, loyal to colleagues, tender with family. His marriage to Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898 was by all accounts genuine. A meeting of two people who actually liked each other, which was rarer in Gilded Age society than it should have been. His love for his daughter Cornelia, born on New Year's Day, 1900, had the particular quality of a man surprised and delighted by fatherhood. He was a good man with an obsession, and that is what makes this story tragic, rather than simply sad. A bad man consumed by an obsession is a morality tale. A good man consumed by an obsession is something harder to look at, because the obsession didn't take him because he was weak. It took him because he was who he was, because the qualities that made him remarkable, his consuming intellectual focus, his capacity for vision, his inability to do anything halfway, were the same qualities that made him unable to step back from the thing he had set in motion. The gifts and the wound were the same thing. He couldn't stop building because the building was the fullest expression of everything he was capable of. He couldn't walk away from Biltmore because Biltmore was the place where the quiet man from the loud family had finally, completely become himself. The prison was built from the same material as the home, and he had built it himself, stone by stone, with his own hands and his own vision and his own consuming, irreversible love for the thing he was creating. which is what makes what happened in February 1914 so difficult to sit with, because you cannot understand how it ends without understanding how completely, how genuinely, how humanly George Vanderbilt loved what he had built. And then reading what the historical record shows as his last act inside Biltmore before he left for the final time. Part 9, The Last Record. February 1914. George Washington Vanderbilt II is 51 years old. There is a final detail in the historical record from these last days at Biltmore. Something small, something that the sweeping historical narratives tend to overlook, in favor of the larger dramatic facts. The last recorded evidence of George at Biltmore before his fatal trip to Washington is a library entry. He was reading, of course, he was reading. The man who had filled 23,000 volumes into a 2-story library over a lifetime of genuine intellectual hunger. The man who had been in that library before the obsession took hold, who had sat with books in the quiet years before he looked at those mountains. And everything changed. Was still there. Still in his library. Still doing the thing he had loved before Biltmore and had never entirely stopped loving. Through all the years of Biltmore's consuming demands. There is something unbearably human about that detail, something that cuts through all the grandeur and the tragedy and the financial devastation and the historical significance and reaches something true about who George Vanderbilt actually was beneath the obsession. He was a reader. He had always been a reader. The house was something he had built around his reading life, an elaborately, catastrophically expensive attempt to create the perfect conditions for the thing he had loved since childhood. He left for Washington in February. Business matters. A routine trip. He had made it before. He would make it again. He said goodbye to Edith. To Cornelia, now 14 years old, growing up inside the most extraordinary private home in America in ways that would mark her for the rest of her very long life. He left. In Washington, he was taken suddenly ill. Appendicitis, severe and fast, emergency surgery with the technology available in 1914, capable but without the antibiotics, the precision, the recovery infrastructure that would make the same procedure routine. Within a generation. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died on a surgical table in Washington, D.C., 51 years old. He did not make it home. Sit with that. Not with the fact of death. Death comes for everyone. Sit with the specific geography of it. Not in his library. Not in the winter garden with its glass ceiling and morning light and the sound of a fountain and the smell of living things. Not on the South Terrace looking out at the Blue Ridge Mountains that had changed everything when he first saw them. As a young man of 25, with a vision so large it barely fit inside his mind. On a surgical table in Washington, D.C. On his way home. He spent 25 years building the most perfect private world ever constructed in America. He gave it everything. His fortune, his health, his years, every other version of himself he might have been. He gave the obsession everything it asked for, and a great deal it had no right to ask for. And the obsession gave him 19 years inside what he had built. 19 years. From the Christmas Day opening in 1895 to his death in 1914. The house got the rest. Part 10. What the obsession left behind and what remains. Edith Vanderbilt was 39 when her husband died. She was left with a 14-year-old daughter, a significantly diminished inheritance, and the largest private home in America, 250 rooms, that cost more to maintain than most institutions could manage. The obsession's bill had come due, and it had come due to someone who had not been the obsessive. Edith was remarkable, not in the way Gilded Age society rewarded, but in the practical, clear-eyed way that real crisis demands. She looked at what George had left her, the house, the reduced fortune, the vast machine of Biltmore requiring constant feeding, and she did not flinch. She made the decision George could never make. In 1914, the same year her husband died, Edith sold approximately 87,000 acres to the federal government. The land became the nucleus of the Pisgah National Forest, the scientific forestry program that Gifford Pinchot had developed on Biltmore's vast acreage. The program George had funded and believed in as part of his vision of a self-sustaining estate became the model for how the United States government would manage its public forest lands. For generations to come, the Obsession's land became the nation's conservation heritage. George would have approved of that. The intellectual in him, the genuine believer in sustainable land management, would have found something right about it. But the house remained, still requiring, still consuming, still presenting Edith and then her daughter Cornelia with the fundamental question the Obsession had never answered. How do you sustain something built beyond any sustainable scale? In 1930, Cornelia and her husband made the decision. That changed everything. They opened Biltmore to the public. The private world George had built to escape the world became a destination for the world. The retreat designed for maximum solitude began admitting paying visitors. The house built in deliberate silence, filled with voices, with footsteps on marble floors, with the sounds of strangers moving through rooms designed for one quiet man's private use. Today, more than 1 million people visit Biltmore Estate every year. More than 1 million people a year go to the place George Washington Vanderbilt II built to be alone. He would find this simultaneously necessary and deeply ironic. The man who bought 125,000 acres to ensure his privacy, who opened his house for the first time with no press, no public announcement, family only, whose final entry in the historical record is a note about what he was reading in his library, visited by 1 million strangers every year. There is something that happens when you stand in front of Biltmore House for the first time, something no photograph prepares you for. Not the scale, though the scale is extraordinary, something in the quality of the presence. The building feels inevitable, not large, not grand, inevitable, as though this specific arrangement of stone and glass and slate in this specific mountain landscape was always going to be here, waiting to be discovered rather than built. That is what an obsession, fully realized, produces. It produces things that erase the evidence of their own making, the struggle, the cost, the years, the sacrifice, and present themselves as simply, naturally, permanently real. George Washington Vanderbilt II built something that feels inevitable. The private railroad that carried his stone is gone. The brick kiln is gone. The 1,000 workers who lived in temporary housing on the mountain are gone, unnamed in almost every account. The hidden attendant who pumped the organ bellows behind the banquet hall wall during dinner is long forgotten. But the house stands, exactly where he put it, facing the same mountains he faced in 1887, when the recognition came and the obsession began. Still the largest privately owned home in America, still in the hands of the family that built it, still catching the morning light. On the same limestone facade that Hunt designed, and Italian stonemasons carved from stone quarried out of the very ground, the house stands on. There are 2 ways to tell his story. The first is the cautionary tale. A wealthy young man poured his inheritance into a monument to his own vision and died at 51, having consumed most of what he had been given. A story about excess, about proportion, lost. That version is not wrong. The second way is harder and truer. A man with a genuine, consuming vision of what beauty could be gave himself to that vision without reservation. He could not stop. He knew he could not stop, and he gave the thing everything anyway. And the thing he built outlasted him by more than a century. The obsession built for silence has been filled with voices ever since. The monument built for one quiet man belongs to everyone now. He built it, it buried him, and it is still there. Every morning, before the gates open, there is a window of time when Biltmore is quiet again. The parking lot's empty, the restaurant's dark, the paths bare of footsteps, and the house is simply the house, the thing George assembled in his mind over years of reading, then built into existence over 6 years. at extraordinary cost. In those quiet hours, something of what he intended is still there. The light on the limestone towers at dawn, the Blue Ridge Mountains holding the house in their frame, the 3-mile approach through the forest, the green tunnel, the anticipation, then the sudden revelation, all of it unchanged, all of it still working exactly as designed more than 130 years later. He built for silence. The silence is still there in the mornings. He built for beauty. The beauty is unchanged. He built for permanence. And the house is permanent, more permanent than its creator, who was given 51 years. To the house's 130 and counting, a man in a library, reading, then standing up, closing the book, leaving the mountains, and never coming back. That is not a Vanderbilt story. That is a human story. About what it costs to build the thing you love most. About what the thing takes in return. About the specific, quiet devastation of giving everything to something that will outlast you and being gone before you fully understood what you had made. He built it. It buried him. And Biltmore, in the end, is where that story lives.